Hello, everyone, and welcome to Is That Even Constitutional? This is a show where we use the lens of the Constitution to dissect current events and address some listener questions and interesting legal issues. My name is Sadhana Devaraja, and I'm not a constitutional scholar, but lucky for me, my good friend Ken Thomas is. Hi, Ken. How are you?
Great, Sadhana. How are you?
I am doing well. We're really excited because today we're about to start season 2 of the podcast, which we are calling the Project 2026 series. We have planned a 10-episode arc that sets forth 10 winnable proposals that we believe would help us reclaim the Constitution through legislation. So, to get us kicked off, Ken, Project 2026, the naming of this is obviously a play on Project 2025, which I think most of our listeners would have heard about by now. If folks haven't, Project 2025 is the 900-page multi-part plan by the Heritage Foundation. They are a conservative think tank in D.C., and they brought together multiple authors to set up this multi-chaptered roadmap for essentially changing the constitutional form of our federal government. And what we've found is since the Trump presidency, Trump 2, started, it's really become a blueprint for a lot of President Trump's second term. And so I'm curious, Ken, when you were pitching this set of proposals as Project 2026, why are we calling it that? And can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Sure, Sadhana. So what I think is relevant to know about Project 2025 is that it actually brought out a number of proposals that had been pretty much considered before, mostly by members of the Republican Party, but they brought them all together in one place, and they really set up a process for changing the nature of government. And when I say a process, I mean that each of these proposals had distinct things that the president could do when he got into office to either implement these proposals and or to fight their way through the courts with them. And so what's most interesting about Project 2025 is that although it was not necessarily something that was agreed upon as a platform for this presidency, it has become a significant part of this presidency. And I think the important thing about Project 2026, our proposal, is that it is going to address 10 issues, most of them legal and or constitutional, where we are going to reclaim the rights of the citizens to their own government in a way that really allows people to participate again in their own government. I think one of the biggest concerns now is the idea that this presidency has been very exclusive of input from either the Democratic Party, from independents, or really from any other voice, rather than the voice of the executive branch. And so the whole point of Project 2026 is to restore our democracy to where it was, which is basically the constitutional process of passing laws, of oversight, of implementation that are really at the core of what our Constitution has always been about.
I love that. And, in the first season that we had, you, over a number of episodes, really described how this unitary executive theory was playing out in this current administration. And so love this kind of focus on, well, how can we strengthen up these other branches of our government to do the work that they're supposed to be doing? And these 10 proposals really addressing Congress. And so maybe that's a significant point about why this is Project 2026 and not maybe Project 2028 or 2029 or another year. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. So the what's interesting about Project 2025 is that it was actually one in a series of Heritage Foundation proposals that has actually been put out essentially every 4 years since the Reagan administration. And so this was not in and of itself something new and different, but it certainly has gotten a lot more, shall we say, implementation than probably a lot of the previous proposals by Heritage. So Heritage's proposals have always been focused on the presidency. The Heritage has never really focused on the Congress and how things can be changed in Congress. However, we do have a better example of a proposal that was directed at the Congress. Now it actually goes back again to the Reagan administration. That is the Contract for America. The Contract for America was a proposal by Congressman DeLay and Congressman Newt Gingrich to essentially introduce in the first 100 days of the Congress a series of pieces of legislation that would not just be addressing policy proposals, but really addressed a number of process proposals. And when I say process, I say things like the balanced budget amendment, which is the idea that the government can't spend more money than it takes in. That was one of the Contract for America proposals. Another one was revoking the Exclusionary Rule Act, which is a provision that prevents evidence that is seized unconstitutionally from being introduced into cases brought against criminal defendants. That was the kind of process and procedure issues that were being pushed with Contract for America. And if you remember back to that era, that was really when the Republican Party took over the House for the first time in 40 years, and in some cases going forward, held the House for many, many years. And the Republicans have also taken the Senate in a number of those years. And really, a lot of the current ascendancy of the Republican Party was based on Contract for America and the various proposals that were put together at that time. Now, that contract was similar, Contract for America is similar to Project 2025, which is that a number of the proposals were actually going to be challenged in court, and they were challenged in court, and sometimes they were struck down. So, for instance, Congress passed a term limits proposal under the Contract for America. That was ultimately struck down as going beyond the authority of Congress to set the terms for people of office. So, again, there are similarities between Contract for America and Project 2025, but the Contract for America really was designed for Congress not only to implement, but also to run on, in the sense that members of Congress signed on to the Contract for America as part of their campaign to say, we will do all these things as a party. So it was really more of a founding and a unifying document than it was just a list of legislative proposals.
Yeah, and, everything I know about Contract with America, I think I learned through conversations with you, Ken, over the years. And so it really seems like, you've been describing that the rise of kind of this modern conservative movement can be traced back to that document and that set of proposals that was so really revolutionary, I think, for cohering the party and setting up the kind of enabling functions that leads us to this like current moment. And so I love kind of the power of thinking about what we can do there. So while this is called Project 2026, I think there's a lot of history behind using a vehicle like this that isn't quite exactly responsive to Project 2025, but is based on kind of previous types of proposals and previous types of kind of ensuring that there's better glide paths to protect our rights. So, can you tell us a little bit about what are some of the proposals we're seeing here in Project 2026?
Sure. And I should say that this is going to be the rest of our series. This is an introduction. The rest of our series, we're going to be taking these proposals one at a time because they're worth looking at, they're worth exploring, they're worth evaluating just how popular and useful these would be as concepts, because although some of these proposals might seem a little obscure, if you look at polling, you will see that these are concepts that resonate with the American people if they've been particularly polled on these proposals or on some of the underlying values. These are all proposals that were chosen specifically because they reached at least 60% of the population agreeing with them. So let's start with one of the biggest ones, which is end the filibuster. That is the Senate filibuster. And for anybody who watches legislation not be passed, that is usually because the Senate filibuster, which has a requirement that 60 senators agree in order for a bill to make it to the Senate floor, stops most legislation. And so the first proposal would be end the filibuster. Second one would be no gerrymandering. This is, of course, responsive to all of the various states that are talking about redistricting and doing it in such a way as to gerrymander more of one party or another into the Congress, and so this would be a proposal that at the federal level, gerrymandering be banned. The third is national voter holiday. That's pretty self-explanatory. Everybody loves a day off, and people would not mind if they had to go vote on that day. Supreme Court term limits. There are proposals out there that would not necessarily stop Supreme Court justices from remaining as judges, but it might stop them from serving on the Supreme Court itself beyond a certain number of years. The most often number proposed is 18 years per Supreme Court justice. Next is popular vote for president. Everybody knows about the Electoral College. Everybody knows sometimes you can win the popular vote, lose the Electoral College. This would be a proposal to stop that, to make popular voting for presidency the standard. Number 6, statehood for Washington, D.C. The area in D.C., people who live in the national capital don't get to vote. They don't get elected representatives. They don't get senators. They don't get representatives. That's something that needs to change and should be changed. Number 7 is right to family planning. Turns out most people in this country support contraception, and they support reasonable access to abortion. And this is something that could be established at the federal level rather than leaving it to the various states. Number 8 is get corporate money out of politics. This is related to the case of Citizens United, which allowed corporate money into politics. This would be proposed as ways to get it out. Number 9 is holding gun sellers accountability. Right now, if a gun seller negligently is selling guns to criminals, they cannot be held liable. This is something that should be addressed. And finally is restoring diverse admissions or affirmative action at the college level. This is something the Supreme Court recently struck down, but this is something that could be changed by legislation to allow for it. So that's the full 10. That'll take us an entire season to get through all of those.
And I love these, Ken, because as you're describing them, to me, it feels like a big range, like big kind of procedural things and kind of things that feel very narrow. But I'm looking forward to diving deeper with you to understand why these 10 are really supportive in terms of protecting and regaining our constitutional rights. And also to pull up on what you said at the beginning here, these are also deeply popular. And so I know when I was in the Obama administration, something that we always came up against with the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare is that whenever we polled on Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, public sentiment was low many times. And if you ever polled on each of the provisions within it, they were wildly popular. And so I kind of love that theme here where, if we really separate each of these out and talk about, how they're resonating with most people, and again, like cutting through media noise and headlines, it sounds like most people find each of these 10 popular. And so they are winnable. And just want to pull up on another point you made earlier, which is that Congress isn't very popular as an institution, right? And so wondering if you could just say a note on that, kind of how this can impact Congress as well and their ability to pass things.
Yeah, what's really interesting is if you watch the poll numbers over the last decade or so, you'll find some very, very stark changes that have happened in this country. One is that our most popular political party by far is no party or independent. The Republican and the Democratic Party have been consistently losing people who are actually members of the party, and more people have been moving to the independent category. And that is obviously a sense that people are not being addressed, and that the things they're interested in are not being addressed, and that in some ways they are disenchanted with the system as it stands. Another thing that is astonishing is the lack of faith in the federal government generally. So it used to be that even in the turbulent 70s, there were still 50–60% of Americans thought the federal government could solve our problems. Those numbers have plunged, and they're down in the tens and 20s. The idea that there actually is a way out of the problems that we see today. And then even lower than that is the U.S. Congress, which is seen as very, very unproductive and is very unpopular because essentially it doesn't seem to be doing anything. And again, we will be trying to address some of those with some of these proposals, the filibuster, the gerrymandering, the voting. These are the kinds of things that make people reconnect with the institution of the Congress, which really often takes a backseat to the president in many ways, and ironically is really where most of the power is supposed to reside. That's what the founding fathers intended, was that the Congress would be the ones setting the policy agenda for the United States. And it's really probably because Congress has been so inefficient and ineffective that the various presidencies have most recently become very dependent on executive powers, sometimes even when those executive powers don't exist. A lot of that is filling in the gap for what something Congress is supposed to be doing.
I love that. And so with Project 2026, the naming is timed with these upcoming 2026 midterm elections. And so while we're, putting these proposals out for listeners and folks to think about and consider, obviously, we would need politicians to support these proposals. And so kind of what's your plea there?
Well, I think what's interesting is that you will find that these various individual proposals are nothing really new. They're nothing that have taken on a big political push in the past, but these are things that certainly a lot of members have proposed legislation on. Some of it has gotten to the House floor. Some of it has passed the House. An interesting one is number 7, the right to family planning. That's essentially putting protections into law that have only previously been really protected by the Constitution. As you may remember, the Constitution was interpreted for many years to protect abortion. It's still held to protect the right to contraception. This is all kind of a interesting oddity in the U.S. because most countries, their legislation regarding family planning is done by the legislatures and it's done by law. And there was actually a proposal during the Obama administration that was to basically put all these protections into law so that we were no longer relying on the Supreme Court to decide what the laws were or were not. And during that brief period in the Obama administration where there is a filibuster-proof majority, in theory, that could have been passed, and that would have been an example of something that would then wouldn't have had the same political resonance, at least as regards the Supreme Court. So these proposals have often been around for a long time. Some are more recent, but it's more a matter of bringing them together, coalescing people around them, and making people recognize that these are important pieces of legislation, and they really should almost be preliminary to any suggestion of what our policy legislation should be.
Yeah, and I think something you've certainly said to me, in contrast to like the low popularity of Congress, what still remains deeply popular is the Constitution. And so framing this within that context, I think, can be really supportive and helpful. All right. So thanks, Ken. Thanks, everyone listening in. We're looking forward to digging in on all of these 10 proposals with you all over this season of Is That Even Constitutional? And we welcome feedback. So to get in touch with us, give us your feedback. Feel free to leave comments wherever you're subscribing to this podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast, especially if you're enjoying the content. And if you want to help make these proposals a reality, you can always email us at production@constitutionpod.com. And we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks so much.